Hello, my friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is David, and I'm here to talk to you about a new, I don't want to say series because probably that puts more pressure on things, but a new idea I had for some videos, which the book I'm talking about tonight is not what originally spurred the idea, but I figured given time that I want to spend and a familiarity with the particular book, um, basically I'm going to talk about books that have earned a permanent place in my library. A lot of books, as I'm reading them, if it is something that I don't feel like I'm going to revisit, that I'm going to want to reread at any point in time in the future, or if, it's just really beat up and shoddy and needs to be replaced anyway, I'm not hanging on to them. So my library is in constant state of change. And so I thought it would be fun and interesting to talk about the books that have earned a spot on my shelf permanently and why they're there. And in some instances, it may be that I hold up a book and say, well, this book has earned a place, but there's a different edition I'd rather replace it with. That's not going to be the case tonight. Not necessarily. I'm pretty happy, actually, with the one I have. Although, any book that's a permanent edition, if there's a hardcover version, one could be argued that it will have better longevity and maintain its integrity, not start to show visible signs of wear for a lot longer than a paperback or even a trade paperback would. So, of course, I had to start off with Tolkien to kick off this series. But I didn't want to start with any of the big three. Silmarillion, Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings. Of course, those are up there. And I'll get to them eventually. Because not putting them in here would be something that would be just a glaring omission. But before, I dive into the obvious, I wanted to make sure this is something that kind of sticks around. It gives me something to pop the camera in to talk for a few minutes about something. It's something that I know that I've read that I want to put on your radars. I know there's a lot of people right now doing the Read What You Own challenge. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to influence you to go and break that to buy this. However, I will talk about some of the reasons why this is a permanent edition in my library. And so, we are talking about a Tolkien Miscellany. And I love this cover right here. I did a quick Amazon search. The only other, there was one hardcover copy. I don't like the cover nearly as much. So I almost want to keep this. This is in pristine condition here. Probably because I haven't read this particular copy. I actually recently unhauled a pair of books that the contents were completely in here. So instead of having 2 volumes plus this, I will send those 2 extra volumes off to the loving care of Stately Von Manor. Figure, at the very least, Roger could get some good use out of them. Anyway, a Tolkien Miscellany. So why is this a permanent addition to my shelf, other than it being something that's by Tolkien? Because that's not a good enough reason. It's all bias aside. So we turn to the table of contents here. And that is what is going to tell us why this should be on here. Okay. So the volume opens up here with Smith of Wootton Major, followed by Farmer Giles of Ham. Okay, those are 2 excellent short stories. They are not, I would argue that Tolkien's best short story follows that in the section known as Tree and Leaf, which has a short story in there called Leaf by Niggle, which is fantastic. But all 3 of those short stories are well worth your time, an incredibly engaging read, and it shows that even outside of Middle Earth, Tolkien could craft a pretty damn good story. And, some of them, Farmer Giles of Ham, shows a lot of his influence and inspiration from medieval literature. It features a dragon in it. So, those 3 stories in themselves would be enough to earn the admission here. But there's more. Of course, with Tree and Leaf, there's also On Fairy Stories, which is an essay where Tolkien writes about the types of stories that you find in fantasy and science fiction kind of grouped together. Stories that in his time were considered fairy stories, things that kind of a more mature fairy tale, so not intended for children, but viewed as something that is more for idle passing of time and not real reading. A bias that we probably still can see today. There are all kinds of lists of awards out there that, when giving consideration to what should merit it, if it is in a genre, it is disqualified almost. It has a bigger hill to climb to get into consideration. Not all awards are like that. Not everybody is like that. But in general, there is a stigma attached to genre fiction. Regardless of which genre you're looking at, whether it's fantasy, science fiction, horror, romance, historical fiction, all of them have certain stigmas attached to them. And all of them, among certain readers, get viewed as lesser fiction. Unfortunately, it's sad. But Tolkien writes to the defense of fairy stories and their place and their merits and why they are just such a rich well to really explore. If you've never read Tolkien's On Fairy Stories and you enjoy any of the genre of fiction, it's definitely well worth your time. There's going to be, it's one that merits close rereading multiple times over the course of your lifetime, because every time I visit it, I get something more out of it. But that's certainly not necessary. You could read it once and still really enjoy it. But it's absolutely worth your time. And then the next segment in here, the longest in terms of the contents here, is The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is a collection of Tolkien's poetry. Now, let's be frank here. Tolkien is not the best poet. He is not at his best when he's writing poetry either. However, he is a serviceable poet. He does a pretty good job as a layman poet. I would argue that his best poetry was found within The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But some of the poems in here might, be enjoyable, memorable. A lot of whimsy, a lot of fairy story content in them. And you can tell that a lot of them were probably geared toward a younger audience, much in the way that The Hobbit was geared towards a younger audience when it was written. That doesn't diminish them in any way, shape, or form. I grew up reading poems, for instance, by Shel Silverstein. I still enjoy them from time to time, even though they're very much written towards a younger audience. They're still enjoyable. And then the last thing that's in here, the one that cements it as being a keeper versus any other versions out there, is it also has Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So Tolkien's translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, as well as this translation of Pearl and Sir Orfeo. Tolkien, as a translator, you will find various different things that Tolkien translated. So if you picked up, for instance, Beowulf, Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, expecting the depths of his scholarly passion and intelligence being shown in there, you won't find it necessarily, because Beowulf, that translation, was not written with the intention of being published. These 3 works that are in here, Sir Gawain, the Green Knight, Pearl, and Sir Orfeo, were written with consideration for publication. So they feel more complete, like a more of an honest translation of trying to both be accurate and entertaining at the same time. Whereas Beowulf, it was a lot of his own personal work to try and muddle things out in his own approach. So very, very different things. Anyway, there you go. So that is the first in this series. I hope it won't be the last. So Tolkien Miscellany is a permanent book on my shelf. It is not likely to be displaced or replaced unless they come out with a version that contains maybe a couple more of his other essays that he wrote, Monsters and Critics, things like that. But I honestly can't think of what it is lacking that would enhance it more, because it has all of the big ones that you would want to read. So if you've read his big three, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, and you don't know where to turn next, this is a great point, because it's going to give you some of his short stories. He didn't write a ton of them. It's going to give you some of his poetry and some of his translation and one of his essays. So it lets you see a lot of Tolkien as a writer, because he did dabble in a couple other areas that were important to him as a writer. And I think you'll enjoy this. So there you go. I will catch you later.